I can still remember the way the mansion looked as I first approached it, towering and grand. It loomed over the dense woods that surrounded it, almost as if it were guarding some ancient secret. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel as I drove up the winding path, trying to shake off the growing unease that settled in my chest. This place was mine now, a gift from a distant uncle I barely knew. I had inherited it, along with the solitude I so desperately needed to finish my novel. But as I stood at the front door, key in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The lock clicked open with an eerie creak, and I pushed the heavy door forward, the sound echoing through the empty halls like a groan. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust and something else I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the smell of an old, abandoned house. It was darker, more oppressive, like the remnants of a fire long extinguished. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight, and the door shut behind me with a soft, deliberate thud, sealing me inside. The first thing that struck me was the silence. It was as if the walls were absorbing every sound, leaving only the faintest rustling of leaves outside. I paused in the foyer, taking in the dim light filtering through the cracked, stained glass windows. The mansion was a labyrinth of dark wood and shadow, with long corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. My footsteps echoed hollowly as I ventured deeper inside, each creak and groan of the old house making me jump. I explored room after room, each one more imposing than the last, filled with antique furniture draped in sheets, as though the previous occupants had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. The walls were adorned with faded portraits, their eyes following me as I moved. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the atmosphere get to me. But there was something about the way those eyes seemed to glint in the dim light that sent a shiver down my spine. By the time I reached the study, I was beginning to regret my decision to come here alone. The room was large and dimly lit, with bookshelves towering from floor to ceiling, crammed with dusty, leather-bound tomes. A massive oak desk sat in the center, its surface covered in papers and a quill pen that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I ran my fingers over the leather chair behind the desk, noticing the thin layer of dust that coated everything in the room. It was as if time had stood still in this place. As night fell, I decided to settle in. I lit a fire in the study's hearth, the flames casting flickering shadows across the room. But even the warmth of the fire couldn't chase away the chill that had settled in my bones. I tried to distract myself, unpacking my belongings and setting up my laptop, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the strange feeling that had been gnawing at me since I arrived. It wasn't until later, when I was lying in bed, that the real unease set in. The house had grown eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on you, making it hard to breathe. I lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft that I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard it at all. My breath caught in my throat, and I strained to listen, every muscle in my body tense. The whisper came again, clearer this time, like a voice carried on the wind, though there was no breeze. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakably coming from somewhere inside the house. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the old pipes, or the wind finding its way through a crack in the wall. But deep down, I knew it wasn't either of those things. The voice was too clear, too deliberate, and as I sat there in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was calling my name. I woke the next morning with the unsettling memory of the whispers still lingering in my mind. The night had been restless, filled with half-remembered dreams and the constant feeling of being watched. I kept telling myself that it was just the unfamiliarity of the house, the isolation playing tricks on me. But as I walked through the mansion in the cold light of day, the sense of unease clung to me like a second skin. The shadows seemed to stretch longer here, lingering in the corners even when the sun streamed through the tall, narrow windows. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant groan of the old wood, made me flinch. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something unseen was following me, watching me with patient, unblinking eyes. I tried to distract myself by exploring more of the mansion, hoping that familiarity would ease my nerves. The mansion was a maze, each hallway leading to more rooms than I could have imagined. Some were opulently furnished, with heavy velvet drapes and ornate chandeliers, while others were barren, their walls cracked and peeling. I found myself in what must have once been a grand ballroom, its polished wooden floor now scuffed and dull. Massive windows lined one wall, their glass smudged and fogged from years of neglect. I could almost imagine the room filled with people, the sounds of music and laughter echoing off the walls. But now, it was just a hollow shell, filled with nothing but echoes of the past. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement in one of the windows. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, staring at the spot where I'd seen it. For a moment, I was sure I saw a shadow move across the glass, as if someone, or something, was passing by outside. But when I rushed to the window and peered out, there was nothing. Just the overgrown garden, tangled and wild, stretching out into the thick forest beyond. The rational part of my mind told me it was just the play of light, a trick of my tired eyes. But a deeper, more primal instinct warned me that something wasn't right. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, I decided to return to the library. It was the one place in the house that still held a semblance of warmth, the only room that didn't feel completely abandoned. I spent hours there, flipping through the dusty old books, most of which were on topics far removed from my own interests. Ancient history, esoteric rituals, strange and obscure sciences. But as I reached for a particularly thick volume, something strange happened. The bookshelf shifted, just slightly, as if it were loose from the wall. My curiosity piqued, I pushed against the wood, and to my surprise, the entire section of the shelf swung inward, revealing a hidden passage. My pulse quickened as I stared into the dark corridor beyond, lit only by the dim light filtering through the gaps in the wood. I knew I should have felt excitement at discovering something so mysterious, but all I felt was dread. This was a place that hadn't seen the light of day in decades, maybe longer, and every instinct told me to stay away. But something else, curiosity, perhaps, or a darker compulsion, drove me forward. The passage was narrow and cold, the walls lined with stone that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. As I ventured deeper, the walls closed in around me, and the darkness grew thicker. I had to rely on the faint light of my phone to guide me, casting eerie shadows on the walls as I walked. The passage twisted and turned, leading me further and further from the familiar parts of the house, until I emerged into a small, hidden chamber. The room was cramped, barely large enough to fit more than a few people. A small, wooden desk sat in the center, and on it, a single item, an old, leather-bound diary. My hands trembled as I reached for it, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. The leather was cracked and brittle, the pages yellowed with age. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. As I opened the diary and began to read, a chill ran through me. The entries were written in a delicate, flowing script, but the words they conveyed were anything but delicate. They told the story of the mansion's dark past, of rituals performed in secret, of spirits bound to this very place through acts of unspeakable horror. And as I read on, one thing became horrifyingly clear. Those spirits were still here, trapped, waiting for someone, waiting for me. The deeper I delved into the diary, the stronger the connection I felt with the house. My head began to ache, and a strange, heavy pressure settled over me, as if something was pressing down on my mind. I could feel the spirits, their presence growing stronger with every word I read. They weren't just trapped here. They were aware of me, watching me, reaching out to me through the words on the page. And then, just as I was about to close the diary, I felt it, a cold, icy breath against the back of my neck. I froze, my blood turning to ice, and for the first time since arriving, I knew with absolute certainty that I wasn't alone. The cold breath against my neck left me paralyzed with fear. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think, as the icy chill seeped into my bones. Every hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and my heart pounded so violently in my chest that I was sure it would burst. I knew I had to turn around, to see what was behind me, but every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to pretend that I hadn't noticed. that I was alone. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it in the air. A presence that was cold and malevolent, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. Slowly, I forced myself to turn, inch by inch, dreading what I might see. The small, hidden chamber was dim, the only light coming from the faint glow of my phone on the desk, but there was enough to see by. My breath caught in my throat as I completed the turn and found myself staring into the shadows that clung to the corners of the room. At first, I saw nothing, just the darkened stone walls and the worn furniture that seemed to melt into the gloom. But then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. It wasn't human, at least not anymore. The shape was gaunt and twisted, as if it had been stretched and warped by years of torment. Its eyes, if you could call them that, glowed faintly in the dark, two pinpricks of malevolence that seemed to pierce right through me. My throat tightened, and I felt a scream building in my chest, but no sound came out. I was frozen, locked in place by sheer terror as the figure began to move. It didn't walk, not exactly. It drifted toward me, its limbs moving in a slow, unnatural way, as though they were barely attached to its body. I wanted to run, to flee from that horrible, twisted thing, but my legs wouldn't obey. I could only watch, helpless, as it came closer, its eyes never leaving mine. The air around me grew colder with every passing second, until it felt like I was standing in the depths of a frozen wasteland, my breath fogging in front of me. The closer it came, the more I could see. Its face was a grotesque mask of decay, the flesh pulled tight over sharp bones, its mouth twisted into a grin that was far too wide, revealing teeth that were long and sharp like those of a predator. It opened its mouth as if to speak, and for a moment, I thought I could hear words, faint, garbled whispers that made no sense, but were filled with an overwhelming sense of hate and anger. Then, without warning, it lunged at me. The movement was so sudden, so violent, that it broke whatever spell had been holding me in place. I stumbled backward, my hands flailing for something to grab onto, but the chamber was too small, too cramped. I hit the wall hard, knocking the breath out of me, but I didn't stop. I scrambled along the wall, trying to put distance between myself and the thing that was now almost upon me. My hand found the edge of the bookshelf, and I yanked myself toward it, desperate to escape. The hidden door was still ajar, and I threw myself through it, not caring how loud the slam was as I pulled it shut behind me. I was plunged into darkness, but I didn't stop. I ran blindly down the narrow passage, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. It wasn't until I burst back into the library, the familiar, dusty smell hitting me like a wave, that I finally stopped. I leaned against the door, my chest heaving, and slowly slid down to the floor, my back pressed against the wood. My whole body was trembling uncontrollably, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't rationalize it. I couldn't convince myself that it was just a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. I had seen it. I had felt it. That thing, whatever it was, had been real, and it had come for me. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was only the beginning. The mansion wasn't just haunted by the memories of the past. It was alive with them, filled with spirits that had been waiting, lurking in the shadows, and now they had awakened. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to calm my mind, to stop the shaking in my hands. But the fear lingered, gnawing at me, refusing to let go. And in the silence of the library, I could still hear the whispers, growing louder, calling my name. I didn't leave the library that night. I couldn't bring myself to step back into the darkness, not after what I had seen in that hidden chamber. I stayed where I was, huddled against the door with my knees drawn to my chest, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace as if they could keep the darkness at bay. But the fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, refusing to let me rest. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, made me jump. I felt like a cornered animal, trapped in a place I no longer recognized. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that twisted figure lunging at me, its mouth stretched wide in that horrific grin. I could still feel the cold breath on my neck, the icy grip of terror that had frozen me in place. The whispers were still there too, faint but persistent, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from all around me. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were telling me things, secrets I didn't want to hear, filling my mind with images of blood and fire, of rituals performed in the dead of night, of sacrifices made in the name of some ancient, unspeakable power. I couldn't stay in the library forever. As the first light of dawn filtered through the dusty windows, I forced myself to stand. My legs were weak, trembling, and I had to lean against the desk for support. The house was quiet now, almost too quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a nightmare, that the things I had seen and heard weren't real. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel it in my bones, in the cold, lingering dread that refused to leave me. I needed answers. I couldn't go on like this, trapped in a house that seemed to be turning against me. The diary was still in that hidden chamber, waiting to reveal its secrets, but the thought of going back there made my stomach turn. Instead, I decided to search the rest of the house, to find out more about what had happened here, about the rituals that had bound the spirits to this place. There had to be something. Old records, letters, anything that could help me understand what I was dealing with. The mansion was even more oppressive in the daylight. The shadows were longer, darker, as if they had grown stronger with the rising sun. I wandered through room after room, finding nothing but dust and decay, the remnants of a life that had been abandoned long ago. The more I explored, the more I felt like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that twisted figure lurking in the doorway. But there was nothing, only the empty rooms and the ever-present silence. It wasn't until I reached the upper floors that I found something. The hallway was long and narrow, lined with closed doors that seemed to stretch on forever. I opened each one cautiously, bracing myself for what might be waiting on the other side. Most of the rooms were empty, filled only with dust and broken furniture. But one door, at the very end of the hall, was different. It was locked. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The key I had used to unlock the front door hung from a chain around my neck, and something told me it would fit this lock too. My heart was pounding, my palms slick with sweat, but I couldn't walk away. I had to know what was behind that door. The key turned easily in the lock, and the door swung open with a creak. The room beyond was small, barely more than a closet, but it was filled with shelves lined with old, leather-bound books and stacks of yellowed papers. A single window let in a sliver of light, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. On a small table in the center of the room sat a box, made of dark wood and covered in intricate carvings. I felt a strange pull toward it, a compulsion that I couldn't explain. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight, and reached for the box. The wood was smooth and cold to the touch, and as I opened it, I felt a chill run through me. Inside were more papers, but these were different, thicker, older, and covered in symbols and writing that I didn't recognize. But what caught my eye was a small, silver pendant lying on top of the papers. It was shaped like an eye, with a dark, gleaming stone at its center. The moment I touched it, a wave of nausea washed over me, and I stumbled back, the pendant clutched in my hand. Images flashed through my mind, faces twisted in pain, flames consuming everything, blood running like a river across the floor. I saw the mansion as it had been long ago, filled with people in dark robes, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. And then I saw myself, standing in the center of it all, holding the pendant high, as the spirits swirled around me like a storm. The visions faded as quickly as they had come, leaving me breathless and shaken. I dropped the pendant back into the box, my hands trembling uncontrollably. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was something more, something dangerous. And now, it was clear that I had been drawn to this house for a reason. The spirits weren't just random ghosts. They were connected to me, to my family, in ways I was only beginning to understand. I knew then that I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until I had uncovered the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. The mansion had its hooks in me, and there was no escaping it now. The only way out was through. As the day wore on, the weight of what I had discovered pressed down on me like a suffocating blanket. The mansion felt more alive, more sentient than ever before. Every room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and I couldn't escape the feeling that the walls themselves were watching me, closing in with every step I took. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and something else, something acrid and metallic, like blood. It clung to me, seeping into my clothes, into my skin, until I felt like I was drowning in it. I carried the box with the pendant and the strange papers back to the library, my mind reeling with the visions I had seen. There was no doubt in my mind now that the pendant held some terrible power, a power that had been used to bind the spirits to this house. And somehow, I was connected to it all. My bloodline, my family's dark history, had brought me here, to this cursed place, and now I was caught in its web. Back in the library, I spread the papers out on the desk, the symbols and writings blurring together in my tired eyes. The pendant lay beside them, its dark stone gleaming ominously in the dim light. I knew I needed to understand what these documents said, to decipher the symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. But the more I stared at them, the more they seemed to resist my attempts to make sense of them, as if they were hiding their true meaning from me. Frustration boiled up inside me, mingling with the fear that had been gnawing at me since I first arrived. I grabbed one of the books from the shelves, an old tome with a cracked leather cover, and began to flip through it, hoping to find something, anything, that could help me. The pages were filled with diagrams, drawings of rituals, and ancient spells, but none of it made sense. The words seemed to swim on the page, taunting me, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. It wasn't until I reached the back of the book that I found something that made my blood run cold. There, on a single page, was an illustration that matched the pendant perfectly, a stylized eye, with the same dark stone at its center. Beneath it, in a language I didn't recognize, were words that seemed to shimmer with a dark, malevolent energy. My hands trembled as I traced the lines of the drawing, a sickening realization dawning on me. The pendant wasn't just a symbol, it was a key to a ritual that had been left unfinished, a ritual that had bound the spirits to this house and to my family. And now that I had found it, the ritual was in motion again. I could feel it in the very air around me, in the way the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe as if alive, in the whispers that had grown louder, more insistent. I was the final piece of the puzzle, the last link in a chain that had been forged generations ago. And the spirits knew it. They had been waiting for me, drawing me here, manipulating me into finding the pendant, into setting things in motion once more. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I doubled over, gasping for breath. It had never been about me finding peace or finishing my novel. It had always been about this, about them, about the ritual that had been left unfinished, and the sacrifice that was still required to complete it. As the truth settled in, a deep, bone-chilling fear took hold of me. I had thought I could uncover the secrets of this house and find a way to escape, but now I realized that there was no escaping this. I was bound to this place just as surely as the spirits were. They had chosen me, lured me here, and now they were closing in for the final act. I couldn't stay in the library any longer. The walls seemed to pulse with dark energy, the shadows flickering and shifting in ways that defied explanation. I gathered the papers and the pendant, shoving them back into the box, and fled the room. The mansion felt like a living entity now, its corridors twisting and turning as if trying to confuse me, to trap me within its dark embrace. I found myself in the grand staircase, the one that led down to the main hall. The light was fading fast, the last rays of the sun casting long shadows across the polished wood. I knew I needed to leave, to get out of the house before night fell completely, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the house itself was holding me in place, forcing me to stay, to face whatever horrors awaited me when the darkness finally claimed the mansion. And then, in the silence, I heard it, a low, rumbling sound, like the growl of some ancient beast. It came from deep within the house, echoing through the halls, growing louder with each passing second. My heart leaped into my throat, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The sound was coming closer, reverberating through the very bones of the house, shaking the walls, the floor, everything. I realized with dawning horror that the house itself was awakening, the spirits within it stirring, preparing for the final act of the ritual that I had unknowingly set in motion. There was no escape, no way out. I was trapped, caught in a web of dark magic and ancient curses, and the only way to end it was to see it through to the bitter end. The house was alive now, its every creak and groan filled with malevolent intent, and somewhere in the shadows, the spirits were waiting, watching, eager for the ritual to be completed. And I, their unwitting pawn, had no choice but to play my part. The sound reverberated through the mansion, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the house. It felt as if the walls themselves were breathing, expanding and contracting with each ominous pulse. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I clutched the box tighter against me. I was no longer in control. This house, this dark, malevolent force, had taken over, guiding my every step toward the inevitable. I moved as if in a trance, my feet carrying me down the grand staircase, through the dimly lit corridors, and deeper into the bowels of the mansion. The air grew colder, the shadows more oppressive, until it felt like I was walking through a dense fog. My surroundings became a blur of dark wood and flickering light, and the only thing that kept me grounded was the box in my hands, its weight pulling me down like an anchor. Somewhere deep inside, I knew where I was headed. The mansion was leading me, pushing me toward the heart of the house, the place where it all began, the place where the ritual had been performed, where the spirits had been bound. I had read about it in the diary, seen glimpses of it in the visions the pendant had shown me, but now I was about to face it for real. My fear was so overwhelming that it was almost numbing, a cold dread that seeped into my bones and dulled my senses. I reached the end of a long, narrow hallway, a place I hadn't been before. The door in front of me was heavy and ancient, its surface carved with the same strange symbols that had covered the papers in the box. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, the cold metal sending a shiver up my spine. I knew what awaited me on the other side, and every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run. But I couldn't. The house wouldn't let me. The door creaked open, revealing a large, circular chamber lit only by the dim glow of candles placed in a ring around the room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty books and strange artifacts, and in the center of the room was a stone altar, worn and stained with the passage of time. The air was thick with the smell of incense and something else, something sharp and metallic that made my stomach turn. The altar was the focal point of the room, and as I stepped closer, I felt the oppressive energy in the air intensify. The pendant in the box seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the stone at its center glowing faintly in the darkness. I knew, without a doubt, that this was the place where the ritual had been performed, where the spirits had been bound to the mansion and to my family. And now, they were waiting for me to finish what had been started. I placed the box on the altar, my hands trembling so violently that I nearly dropped it. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent, filling my ears with a cacophony of voices that overlapped and clashed, each one vying for my attention. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the urgency in their tone was unmistakable. They were urging me to act, to complete the ritual, to bring them the closure they had been denied for so long. The pendant called to me, its pull irresistible. I lifted it from the box, the cool metal searing into my palm, as if it had been heated by some unseen fire. The moment it touched my skin, the room seemed to shift, the walls closing in, the shadows deepening. The spirits were all around me now, invisible but palpable, their presence pressing in on me from all sides. I could feel their anger, their desperation, their hunger for release. With trembling hands, I placed the pendant at the center of the altar, right where the symbols converged in a twisted, intricate design. The moment it touched the stone, a shockwave of energy rippled through the room, knocking the breath from my lungs. The candles flickered violently, their flames stretching high, casting wild, dancing shadows on the walls. The whispers turned into a roar, a deafening chorus that filled my head, drowning out my thoughts, my fears, everything. The pendant glowed brighter, the stone at its center flaring to life with an eerie, unnatural light. I could feel it pulling at me, drawing something out of me. My strength, my will, my very soul. The ritual was in motion, and there was no stopping it now. The spirits were using me, channeling their energy through me, using my body as a vessel to complete the work that had been left unfinished. I tried to fight it, to pull away, but my body was no longer my own. I was a puppet, my limbs moving of their own accord, my mouth forming words I didn't recognize, chanting in a language that felt ancient and powerful. The energy in the room intensified, swirling around me like a storm, and I could feel the spirits growing stronger, their presence almost overwhelming. Then, in the midst of it all, something changed. The roaring in my ears quieted, the shadows receded, and a strange calm settled over me. The pendant's light dimmed, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a sensation that was oddly comforting. The spirits weren't just taking, they were giving, sharing something with me, something that had been hidden deep within the house, within the ritual, within myself. In that moment, a realization hit me, a truth that had been buried beneath layers of fear and darkness. The spirits weren't just bound to the mansion, they were bound to me. We were connected, not just by blood, but by something deeper, something that had been set in motion long before I was born. The ritual wasn't just about finishing what had been started. It was about unlocking that connection, bringing it to its full potential. And then I understood. The key to breaking the curse, to freeing the spirits and myself, wasn't just in completing the ritual. It was in embracing it, in accepting the darkness that had been passed down to me. The power, the knowledge, the burden of the spirits. It was all a part of me, and it always had been. The final words of the chant slipped from my lips, and the room fell into an eerie silence. The pendant pulsed one last time, then went dark, its light extinguished. The oppressive energy lifted, the shadows receding, and for the first time since I had arrived, the mansion felt still, peaceful, even. The spirits were gone, their presence no longer pressing down on me, and I was left standing alone in the chamber, the weight of what had just happened settling over me. I had completed the ritual, but not in the way I had expected. I had brought an end to the cycle, not by fighting the darkness, but by accepting it, by understanding that it was a part of me, a part of my family's legacy. As I stood there, the pendant still in my hand, I felt a strange sense of relief, of closure. The mansion was no longer a prison. It was a part of me now, just as I was a part of it. The spirits had been freed, their torment finally over, and in doing so, they had freed me too. I walked out of the chamber, the door closing softly behind me, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt like I could breathe again. The mansion was silent, the oppressive atmosphere gone, replaced by a calm that felt almost soothing. The house had given up its secrets, and in return, I had given it a piece of myself. As I made my way back to the front door, the pendant still clutched in my hand. I knew that I was leaving something behind, a part of my past, my fears, my doubts. But I was also taking something with me, a strength that I hadn't known I possessed, a connection to something far greater than myself. The door opened easily as I stepped out into the fading light of dusk, the cool air washing over me. I glanced back at the mansion one last time, its dark silhouette looming against the sky, but it no longer felt like a place of fear. It was a place of power, of history, and it was mine. With a deep breath, I turned and walked away, the pendant warm in my hand, knowing that I would carry the mansion's legacy with me wherever I went. The darkness was no longer something to fear. It was a part of me now, and I would never be the same. If you like this supernatural story, subscribe, like, and comment, and see the next supernatural horror story.